introduction, and thanks again. Continue to join the meeting. Thanks a lot for the introduction, and thanks a lot to the organizers for inviting me. So I'll be talking about the absence of superdiffusion in certain random spin models. This is work that appeared on arXiv 2 weeks ago. So this is also going to be my first talk about this, so any feedback would be extremely useful. So all of this research occurred at the University of Cambridge in collaboration with Austin Lamacraft and with Jonah Herzog-Eiwitman, who did his MPhil at Cambridge and has since moved on to Princeton University, where he's been doing amazing work. So a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about. First, I'm going to give some general introduction to transport and more specifically to transport properties in the Heisenberg model, which is really the kind of model that I'm going to be focusing on. Then I'm going to give a short introduction to when we can expect superdiffusion and what people understand is superdiffusion to be. After that, I'll move on to a setting where some of the conditions for superdiffusion are broken, noisy spin chains, and try to see if we can still find some trace of superdiffusion. And the title of my talk is going to be a slight spoiler. And after that, I'll move on to the outlook and the conclusions. So first of all, transport in the Heisenberg model. I'm going to be focusing not on energy transport, but on spin transport, and kind of trying to ask the question, what is the nature of spin transport in the Heisenberg chain? And to focus thoughts, I'm going to be focusing on a one-dimensional case where we know that things get interesting. I'm going to be interested in transport at high temperature, where you can't just describe transport in terms of some elementary excitations. So we're going to first start with the anisotropic Heisenberg model. We have some nearest neighbor interactions, XX, YY interactions, and some anisotropy delta. And this model conserves spin polarization, so the Z component of the spin. And if some operator is locally conserved, then it needs to undergo transport. So if we have some initial imbalance in this conserved quantity, it can't be created, it can't be destroyed because it's conserved. So it's going to be transported throughout the system. And one example where people typically see this is you prepare your system in some initial boundary wall state. So lots of spins down, lots of spins up. There's a polarization imbalance. You can plot it in this way if you just plot the polarization as a function of site index n. And if you let your system evolve, you're going to see that this boundary gets smoothened out. And as you increase time, it becomes smoother and smoother. And as you increase time, you introduce some characteristic length scale, which I'll just denote L, which typically grows in time. And the way in which this grows in time kind of determines the kind of transport you can be expecting. So it grows as time with some power, which is an exponent 1 over z, where z is also known as a dynamical exponent. And what we typically expect in generic systems, if you open your favorite book on transport, you expect profiles looking a bit like this, which kind of spread out in time, suppose for some initial localized imbalance. And then that's when you get diffusion. We have some complicated many-body system, which you can effectively forget all about the complicated dynamics in there, and just treat your transport using Fourier's heat equation, which we've all solved. So if you have some initial delta function, your perturbation is going to spread out in time in this Gaussian way, where you have some diffusion constant d. And crucially, this is a function of x squared over t. So the characteristic length scale grows as the square root of time. The width grows as square root of time, which means exponent 1/2, which means we have a dynamical exponent z equals 2. Of course, that's only one of the things, and we expect this to be generic, but of course, we're not always in a generic case. An alternative is ballistic transport, which is something that's really observed in a system where you have conserved quantities, which is essentially when your excitations or perturbations propagate in the system without decaying, which is typically quantified by introducing a so-called Drude weight, which means if you have some initial current, say J, and you have some conserved quantities in your system, they're typically gonna they might prevent this current from decaying. And the way you can see this is just by expanding your initial operator current J into these conserved quantities, which is kind of written on this right-hand side here. Then if you take the thermodynamic limit of infinite system size, this might either constrain your dynamics or not. And if you have a non-zero Drude weight, it means you're going to have a non-vanishing current at arbitrary times, which means that any perturbation, any initial imbalance, you're going to propagate with a constant velocity, which means that your characteristic length scale grows linearly in time, which means you're going to have a dynamical exponent z equals 1. And there's been this great review recently by Bruno Bertini and co-authors, which really discusses all kinds of transport. And so the question is then, what do we expect to see in the Heisenberg chain? So what we actually see is we have the Heisenberg chain. It's very much non-generic. It's 1D. At special points, it has non-abelian symmetry. And it's integrable, which means that it has an extensive amount of conservation laws. And these conservation laws also very strongly depend on the anisotropy delta. And it also has a non-trivial phase diagram. So we have these different phases as we change the anisotropy. So we go from zero, anisotropy zero, from a gapless mode to a gapped mode at infinite anisotropy with a phase transition in between at anisotropy 1, which is the isotropic point. And so we can kind of see what happens in these two different limits. So if the anisotropy is 0, then we have the XX and the YY interaction. And we know that this model, through a Jordan-Wigner transformation, can be mapped to a bunch of free fermions. And free fermions propagate ballistically. So in this limit, you expect ballistic transport. On the other hand, if you look at strong anisotropy, you essentially just have nearest neighbor interactions, ZZ interactions, plus some hopping due to some perturbation. And in this limit, we know that transport occurs diffusively. And this is some kind of very hand-waving arguments, but lots of people have looked at this very rigorously. And we know that these two limits have this behavior. And in between, of course, we have these two different dynamical exponents, and they can't just smoothly connect. And there's an actual transition occurring exactly at the point where we have the phase transition, exactly in the isotropic Heisenberg model. So we have XYZ interactions. And what we observe then is that the characteristic length, L, grows as the power of t to the power of 2/3. So we have something that's faster than diffusion, but slower than ballistic, because of course ballistic is the fastest it can go. And this means we have a dynamical exponent 3/2, which is indicative of superdiffusion. And really, the most important thing here is that the model is integrable, and that exactly at this transition, all three spin components are preserved. So we don't just have the regular U1 symmetry associated with spin polarization, but we have total SU2 symmetry. And this is going to be enough to show that we have superdiffusion. And there's this great review by Virabul Shamdani and co-authors really discussing all different aspects of superdiffusion, which I'm only going to touch upon in the following slides. So brief introduction to superdiffusion now. So superdiffusion really arises from this combination of integrability and this extension of the symmetry from just an abelian symmetry to a non-abelian symmetry. And in fact, it's been shown by Enielewski and co-authors that the combination of these two elements is enough to always lead to superdiffusion. And this has also led the authors to term this so-called superuniversality of superdiffusion. Like you really only need these two relatively simple ingredients, and you're going to have some highly non-trivial transport. And there's some intuition because lots of integrability can be dynamics and transport integrability can be recast in terms of generalized hydrodynamics. Because we know integrability, it gives you conservation laws, low conserved quantities, but you can alternatively interpret this as the existence of particles that do not decay and those particles that then govern your transport. And so using arguments from generalized hydrodynamics, people have gained some intuition for this superdiffusive transport as transport generated by like giant Goldstone-like quasiparticles, which are stable because of integrability. They are thermally screened, but still they survive long enough to lead to this superdiffusive transport. So at long time, you really expect transport to be determined by very long range excitations, which are in some way stable because of integrability. But I won't really touch about general hydrodynamics beyond that. And the nice thing, because of this superuniversality, is it was first observed in the Heisenberg chain at the isotropic point. But that's not the only system where we have integrability and non-abelian symmetry. We can have not just Hamiltonian dynamics, but also unitary circuit dynamics can also satisfy these two constraints. And we can even go beyond quantum dynamics to classical dynamics, where superdiffusion has also been observed in classical spin chains and classical circuits. And this might not sound that impressive, but actually it has a massive numerical advantage in that Hamiltonian dynamics is typically quite costly to simulate, but these other models are a bit simpler. And so one example here is unitary circuit models. So instead of having just a lattice Hamiltonian that's with transport in continuous time, we can focus on just a discrete time, where instead of having dynamics governed by a local Hamiltonian, we're going to build a circuit out of local unitary operators. So every blue square here is some local unitary operator acting on two spin sides. And it can be seen as some kind of trotterization of the XXX Heisenberg Hamiltonian, we're going to choose these two-side unitaries to have this form, which is cosine theta, then the identity, minus I sine theta, and this here is the exchange operator, which is simply a more convenient way of writing this Heisenberg next nearest neighbor interaction. Again, because it's purely isotropic, it has this simple form. And so for small theta, we have something that's essentially the identity plus some small correction, which is what we get in trotterization. But it can be any arbitrary angle, and you're still going to see this superdiffusive transport. Then if you build a full circuit out of these gates, just first coupling nearest neighbors, then staggering this and repeating that, you can have evolution in discrete time, which is relatively easy, or at least easier than Hamiltonian dynamics to simulate. And so this was done by these authors in this paper, which allowed us to learn a bit more about the exact nature of transport in these superdiffusive models. So we don't just have this dynamical exponent z equals 3/2. You can actually calculate the correlation profile. And you can see that there's a very neat collapse. So on the left-hand side here, I'm showing their results on correlations for either for either the current or the gradient in spin polarization. And the left-hand side is a continuous model, so just Heisenberg Hamiltonian. Right-hand side is the discrete unitary circuit model. And you can see a very neat collapse of all profiles if you plot it as a function of t to the power 2/3, so we have the dynamical exponent there. We also see that this collapse isn't quite on this Gaussian profile, which is the green line that you'd expect in, for example, diffusion. It goes to a slightly more complicated profile, which falls off quicker at the edges. And that's the kind of profile that you expect for systems that are in the Carter-Parisi-Zhang universality class, which is a kind of extension of diffusion, which also has inbuilt nonlinearities and white noise. Now, for people who aren't that familiar with Carter-Parisi-Zhang scaling functions or the KPZ equation, despite the fact that Parisi won the Nobel Prize very recently, which was a nice motivation to keep working on this, that you can relate KPZ to the Burke's equation. But the typical way of introducing this equation is you have some kind of function h, which can be thought of as some height field. So you have growth on some surface of some height field, and you have three components on the right-hand side of your equation. So the first is just some kind of smoothing. So here you have the Laplacian, which is what you'd expect just in diffusion. Then the second term is some relevant nonlinearity proportional to the square of the gradient of your height field. So if you think of this in terms of surface growth, you here essentially have an initial term proportional to the slope of your surface. And then the third part is what makes it interesting, that this is essentially a stochastic model where you introduce some additional white noise, which is going to serve to roughen the surface. And so in this way, you can have some non-trivial profile at long times. And there's a relatively straightforward argument to show that you need to get a dynamical exponent of 3/2 in this model. So instead of looking at this height field, I'm going to look into its gradient. So I can define this function v. Then I get a similar differential equation for this function. And nice thing is here that the left-hand side, which has delta tv plus v delta xv, exhibits so-called Galilean invariance, which relates your space and time exponents. And by showing that the steady state exhibits some kind of white noise profile, you can immediately argue that this needs to have a dynamical exponent z equals to 3/2. I'm not going to go into detail, but it's a relatively straightforward calculation. And so we have this dynamical exponent, and we have the scaling functions, which also apparently seem to show up in these Heisenberg models. And the cool thing is that initially there's been a bunch of theoretical work, but I also want to conclude this introduction to superdiffusion by pointing out that there's been two really cool experimental works directly observing this superdiffusion. So it's not just some theoretical anomaly, which is what people often think of when they think of some kind of dynamics in integrable models, but something that's actually physically relevant. So the first experiment I want to mention is this one by Shai et al., which was published in Nature Physics. And they observed this KPZ scaling in this potassium copper fluoride material using neutron scattering. So the material looks something like this. And if you look into the orbitals of these molecules, you'll see that there's a strong bonding along the vertical axis and very weak bonding in the horizontal plane. So essentially this material behaves like a bunch of 1D chains which only very weakly interact with each other. And the cool thing is that these 1D chains behave very closely to an ideal antiferrometric Heisenberg Hamiltonian with spin 1/2. So exactly what we want to observe this superdiffusive scaling. And so using neutron scattering, you can directly measure dynamical spin structure factors, so the Fourier transform of your correlations. And if they do this, they get something looking like this. So here on the right-hand side, I plot this dynamical structure factor at relatively low frequency as a function of momentum q. And so in the gray part of these figures, you can see that you get some non-trivial information about the dynamics, whereas the white part is only inelastic scattering, which doesn't tell you anything. So, probably does to some people, but not to me. And so what you see here is the dynamical structure factor as a function of different temperatures. So first 75K, then 100, up to 300K. So this transport, this superdiffusion, is something that can be observed at high temperatures and also shows up at infinite temperature, actually. And so if you plot some slope, so if you fit some slope to these dynamical structure factors, you'll see that, for example, here this behaves at momentum to the minus 1.4, minus 1.6, minus 1.56. So all very close to this minus 3/2, which is what you expect from KPZ scaling or from a dynamical exponent 3/2. You simply plot this in, do the inverse Fourier transform. It's going to tell you that you need to have a characteristic length scale grows as time to the power 2/3, sorry. And so this is some first indication that there's superdiffusive transport. Just to compare, in this figure at 300K, so the bottom panel, they also plotted what would happen if you had q to the minus 1, so ballistic, or q to the minus 2, which is diffusive. You can clearly see that the experimentally measured correlation, dynamical spin structure factor, falls in between. So it really falls in between ballistic and diffusive. So that was the first experiment. And the second experiment was, in a way, a much more direct observation of superdiffusion, at least for theorists. I think for experimentalists, it's much more involved. So this was work by Y et al., which appeared on arXiv recently, where they observed a KPZ scaling in a quantum gas microscope. So they have a 1D array of 50 spins called atoms in an optical lattice. And they can directly measure the occupation of spin up polarized spins and spin down polarized spins. And they can initially prepare their system in some boundary wall state, which is exactly what you want to measure transport. I'm not going to focus on that, but then what they do is they prepare their system in this boundary wall state. So spin up, spin down, reminiscent of my first slide, and let it evolve. And they measure the polarization transfer of one half of the system to the other half of the system. And they get something looking like this, which isn't that meaningful. But then if you plot it on this logarithmic scale, you can clearly see that the polarization transfer P grows in time with this exponent that's characteristic of KPZ scaling. And so we can again compare with the ballistic line and the diffusive line, I think this orange and this blue line. And again, it falls in between. Nice thing is also that you don't just have access to just the overall polarization transfer. You can directly measure the polarization on each side, which means you can directly plot the spin profile. And if they did that and plot this as a function of t to the power 2/3, so exactly this dynamical exponent you expect, they have a very neat collapse. So you don't just get dynamical exponents in this really nice experiment, you can also directly probe these characteristic scaling functions. So that was kind of concludes my introduction to superdiffusion. And so clearly we expect this to show up in these Heisenberg models. There's very convincing arguments, both theoretically and numerically. Now we want to investigate some parts of the stability of superdiffusion, which brings me to noisy spin chains. So we need these two ingredients, integrability and SU2. So we're going to now consider a system where we break integrability by introducing noisy exchange couplings, but preserve the SU2 symmetry. And the problem is, if you look into this kind of system, you quickly have a lack of theory tools to tackle these problems. So there's been some result on dynamics and integrability broken systems where you expect, for example, pre-thermalization, but nothing that's directly applicable to this high temperature transport. And also we're trying to perturb this isotropic Heisenberg Hamiltonian. And there's no natural small parameter that we can expand into to try some kind of perturbative approach. So the model that we're going to be considering is the Heisenberg model, where we introduce an additional noise on the exchange coupling. So we have a Hamiltonian, we have next nearest neighbors interactions, which is exchange coupling. We have an overall Heisenberg interaction J, but we also introduce some white noise on the couplings, and different sides have statistically independent noise. So clearly this preserves SU2, but breaks integrability. And the neat thing is that here we can develop a perturbation theory near the strong noise limit. And ideally, hopefully, we'd be able to reconstruct like the unperturbed limit from the strong noise limit, but at the least it's going to give us some insight into what happens to superdiffusion if you have strong noise on your exchange couplings. So the way you can then calculate the dynamics, so you just plug this in your regular Schrödinger equation, and instead of writing everything out in time, introduce some equation looking like this. So my change in my state has two parts. So we have this exchange coupling, and here we have just the Heisenberg Hamiltonian with the strength J, evolution in time. And we've absorbed, kind of rewritten our fluctuation on the exchange coupling in terms of some kind of Brownian motion. So these belong to this is an stochastic differential equation where these dW's essentially behave as white noise, as Brownian motion, which means that these differentials, if you average them over your noise realizations, they average out to 0, and they're independent, but their variance scales as dt. So you have this equation, and if you want to be completely correct, you also need to introduce this additional term that preserves the norm, so just some constant. But that's not really going to be important for what follows. So this is how states evolve, but we're interested in transport, and specifically high temperature transport. So we're more interested into looking into how operators evolve. So what we do, and I think this is a particularly cute derivation that I want.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please do.
Before you sort of shoot off into the horizon. So, I mean, what motivates this particular choice for the? I'm sure that people who do this professionally understand, but what motivates this particular choice of stochastic Schrödinger equation? Is it just you want to see? Is it just you want to add some noise to the Heisenberg?
Yes.
Dynamics and see what it does. So there's no other, right? So you just pick the simplest. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. So we picked the simplest noise that would still preserve SU2 symmetry. So we didn't want to touch the term of interaction, like the form of the interaction, but we wanted to break integrability, which we simply did by adding this noise.
Oh no, the second bit is what I was missing. Okay, so that then is indeed the simplest. Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, if anyone.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please do.
So here you're writing a stochastic differential equation for the state.
Yeah.
At some point, I guess you will average over the noise.
Yes.
And you will get an equation that's, if I did it on top of this equation for the density matrix and averaged over the noise, I would get an Imbladian.
So that's my next slide, exactly.
Okay, I'll ask then.
Great, yes. Okay, so if I do this, so I don't do this for the density matrix, but rather for a generic operator, so I'm going to just end up with the dual of the equation for the density matrix. So I have this equation of motion for some operator. I have my unitary evolution, where I simply introduce some small Hamiltonian dH, which is, again, a combination of this Heisenberg interaction with this Brownian motion or these fluctuations. So I assume I take a small step here. So I can use the Baker-Campbell-Hausdorff equation to expand this unitary transformation. Instead of just keeping the first order term, as is usually done, I need to keep the first two order terms. And then I can use this averaging over like disorder realizations, using the properties that average of just the noise term is 0. So if I just average this first term, I'm going to average over this second noise in the Hamiltonian, that's just going to disappear. And it also shows why I need to keep the second term, because if I have two realizations of the Hamiltonian, if I have two noise terms with the same dW, they're also going to give me a contribution dt. If I do this, do the averaging, I get an equation of motion for this average of these noise realizations. And I can simply rewrite this in a simpler form. We have that the evolution of your operator, simply I times the commutator with your Heisenberg Hamiltonian, and then this additional Lindblad term. So for convenience, I've set the strength of the perturbation of the fluctuations equal to 1. So the only remaining time scale in my system is really just the strength of this Heisenberg interaction. And this has a very specific form, which is basically exchange operator, observable, exchange operator, minus observable. Don't know if this answers your question somehow, or if you have an additional question about this.
Yeah. So all I was going to point out is that your in this Lindbladian, your Hamiltonian commutes with your jump operators.
Yes.
In the sense, it probably simplifies a lot the analysis in what follows, and this is a little bit maybe answers what Claeys was saying. You have P.
Yeah. No.
But the different PNs don't commute among themselves.
No. No.
Okay, got it. That's good.
Yes.
So I'll ask later then. Thanks.
Okay, great, thanks. So we have this equation of motion, and that's something tractable. So I introduced this just from a Hamiltonian with fluctuating noise. But since we know that superdiffusion can arise both in Hamiltonians and from unitary circuits, we actually also found a way of motivating this Lindblad equation of motion by random unitary circuits. So again, I build up this unitary operator consisting out of simply two-side unitary structure, unitary circuits. I again take the same kind of gate, which we know was a trotterization of the Heisenberg Hamiltonian if I chose all of these angles theta to be the same. But here I just choose them to also fluctuate in time, where the average just gives me j times dt, which is what you'd expect for a trotterization of the Heisenberg Hamiltonian. But they also have variance, which is equal to dt, where again, I've just set the strength of the fluctuations equal to 1. And this is a much simpler calculation. So I can just check how a single operator evolves with a single local gate. I do this, I simply plug in this definition of my gates. I recall my double angular formulas, and then I see that I have operator plus I over 2 sine 2 theta, this commutator, which is the Hamiltonian term. And again, we can take theta to be small, so this is essentially just I times the average of theta. And then we have, again, this Lindblad term proportional to sine squared of theta. So this is going to give you like the variance of theta. So if you choose this order to be fluctuating, you again recover the same kind of dynamics that we had before. So that kind of concludes the introduction of this equation of motion. And now I want to use this to say something about transport. And I'm going to be looking into like infinite temperature spin correlation functions and looking into the ZZ terms, which I could choose XX or YY. It wouldn't make a difference because of SU2 symmetry. I'm just going to focus on Z. So I'm going to take some initial sigma Z operator localized on a specific site N. I'm going to evolve this in time using my equations of motion. And then I'm going to see how this correlates with just a Pauli Z operator at some fixed site. Of course, I need to normalize this. So the way you can do this, the way you can think of this, is I have my operator which evolves in time. I can always expand this in a basis which is simply a product of Pauli matrices. So I start from a very simple initial operator, sigma Z, which is just sigma Z on one side and identity everywhere else. But if I'm going to let this evolve because of the interactions with the Hamiltonian and the Lindblad terms, this is going to become more and more involved as time goes on. But then initially, if I want to calculate this correlation function, I simply need to look at the component which again has a single sigma Z term, identity everywhere else, but on a different side. And I kind of can graphically represent it in this way. So I start from a single operator, just identity almost everywhere except for a single site. And I want to see after time t what the component is with identity everywhere with sigma Z at some different place. Probably not telling you anything you don't know. And it's really easy to see what happens in the strong noise limit where we completely forget about the fact that we have a Hamiltonian and only keep the fluctuation. So any operator dynamics here is purely driven by the noise in this exchange term. And then we have an equation of motion looking something like this. And because the Heisenberg interaction essentially just behaves as an exchange operator, I can just plug in a single sigma Z operator and see what happens here. Like first, this term is going to displace it by one step, either to the left or to the right. Then I'm going to just need to subtract identity here. So if I look into the change of time of a single sigma Z on a single side, I basically get this equation of motion, which is exactly what you get if you had a discrete second derivative. So I basically immediately recover the heat equation. So I get purely diffusive dynamics. You can kind of formalize this by writing my operator, which is evolved in time, as just some linear combination of Pauli Z matrices on each side with some prefactor, some amplitude. And this simply satisfies the diffusive equation. So this is already very simple because we started from, in principle, we have this operator which can contain any possible product of Pauli matrices on different sides. But if we only have noise, if we start from a single sigma Z, will remain in this single one operator space. So that's already a massive simplification. If we just represent this graphically, you can see that we're just going to have a single sigma Z essentially undergoing discrete random walk through the system. So we're going to get diffusion. Of course, this isn't really telling us anything about Heisenberg Hamiltonians because it's just random noise, but still. We can extend this to two operator sectors. if you want to look into, for example, higher order correlation functions. We have the same thing. For example, if I start with sigma x and sigma y, because of noise, they are again just going to diffuse freely through the system, with additional constraint that because we have strings of Pauli matrices, we know that we can only have one Pauli matrix on each side. So if you would think of this as a two-particle problem, these essentially diffuse freely with a hardcore constraint, so they can't be on the same side. So this is just if I only have noise. Now we're interested in what happens if we reintroduce the role of the Hamiltonian. So have some non-zero J, so some non-zero average exchange coupling. Well, if I look into this commutator, then if I commute the exchange operator with a single sigma z, I'm going to end up with a sigma x and a sigma y, depending with plus or minus sign, depending on which side it is. And of course, the sum of these two is going to vanish because spin is conserved. And if I commute the exchange interaction, so the Heisenberg Hamiltonian, with a neighboring x and y Pauli matrix, I get a z again. So essentially, this couples the one operator sector where you only have Pauli z operators to the two operator sector where you have Pauli x and y matrices, and so on. So these commutators essentially describe operator splitting, where a z can split into an x and a y, or an x can split into a y and a z, and merging, where they can also recombine. So instead of just focusing on the one operator sector or the one particle sector, if you want to be exact, we need to take into account really all possible operators, all possible products of Pauli matrices. And you can just write down the equation of motion for the components. You can kind of absorb all these signs and all these fully antisymmetric tensors in this one tensor. So basically we have some sum over sides, where here basically operators can split and merge. And then the second part is just going to give you diffusion. I can represent this graphically because this isn't a very intuitive equation. So instead of just having this very simple sigma z or sigma x and y diffusing free throughout the system, I can get something that looks a bit like this. So again, I start from a single sigma z on a single side. It can diffuse because of the noise term, but because of the Heisenberg interaction, it can also split into a Pauli x and a y, which can then themselves again diffuse through the system because of noise. And these can in turn again split and recombine. And if I want to be completely exact, I need to write down all possible diagrams and take into account all possible contributions like this. But this also suggests a natural simplification. So we see that we have noise at diffusion, the Heisenberg interaction split and merge. So we can simplify this by only keeping track of the one and two operator sectors. So instead of considering this wild branching of operators, we're only going to be considering single sigma z operators splitting into x and y, possibly recombining and then splitting again. So
question.
Yes, go ahead.
So in the diagram you put here and in the previous one,
yes,
I thought that the splitting was going forwards in time. It's a branch
yes.
and a coalescence. The way you've done the diagram, oh, okay. Like I see it on my screen. On the left, top left, you have a Y going into a set and an X that seems to be horizontal.
No, but that's...
Oh, that's a branching of...
Yes,
X.
exactly. Yes.
Okay, got it. Yeah. So this is really like diffusion, branching, and coalescence.
Yes, exactly.
Isn't that and I don't? Is that a reasonable description for these dynamics?
So this is completely exact for this noisy model, where the balance between split and merge and diffusion is set by your interaction strength, and so the strength of your noise. So we're going to first do this approximation, just keeping these simple terms, and then we're going to compare with more advanced numerical simulations to kind of justify why this is a good approximation, even if you have the full Limbaugh equation.
And what you have to do is you run what this looks to me is a trajectory of a branching, coalescing, reaction diffusion problem, conditioned on coming back to a single particle.
Yes, exactly.
So because if I run it, I expand.
Yes, yeah, but those won't matter because then these won't show up in the correlation function. Yeah, you really start from a single z and you want to get back to a single z.
So it's really a conditioned dynamics problem.
I think so, yes.
Nice, thanks.
Okay, great. So we're only going to keep track of these one and two operator sectors. So we just assume that our operator is going to either be a single z somewhere in the system or a single x and y somewhere in the system. And so we're really completely ignoring the fact that these x's and these y's can themselves again split. So I can write down the equations. They're not that pretty, but they're much easier to solve. Also, we don't have an exponentially large amount of them. We just have something that grows quadratically with your number of sides. So just to give you some idea, so here you can see that CZn, which is basically the component of sigma z on side n, we have this discrete Laplacian, and we have some coupling to the xy sector where with plus and minus signs. And we can also have the equation of motion for x and y, coupling to the z components, which both diffuse freely, and this last term of the equation is simply because of the hardcore constraint. But that doesn't really matter, and I won't be coming back to this. But the idea is that this is a relatively simple problem that you can tackle using conventional methods. And you can express the Fourier transform of this correlator just by messing around with the equations in terms of a self-energy. So we have some function of momentum eta and frequency omega. And so we have some self-energy that we need to evaluate. We can just write it down. So we have something that's proportional to j squared. Sorry, just going to take a quick drink. And just some sum, where we have some vertex weight. And we have just this dispersion relation in the unperturbed model, which is basically 4 sine squared eta over 2. But for transport, we're going to be interested in low momentum mode. So this is essentially giving you something proportional to momentum squared. So if we just have diffusion and no splitting and merging, then we simply have I omega minus eta squared, and this is what you get for diffusion. The nice thing is also that because splitting of z into x and y occurs with the opposite sign of splitting of z into y and x, you can completely forget about the hardcore constraint of your particles, which also makes this analysis of the first order much easier. And so we have this expression for the self-energy, which we can in principle just calculate at all possible values of momentum and frequency, but it's quite ugly. So we're going to take the hydrodynamic limit. We're essentially only interested in dynamics at low frequency and low momentum. So we take the limit where omega of eta goes to eta squared, and the frequency is also of a similar order. We find something looking like this. So we have our self-energy, proportional again to j squared, so our exchange coupling, again, quadratic term, and then 1 plus 1/2 square root of eta squared minus 2i omega. So just qualitatively, we find that we originally in our correlator had a diffusion pole at omega minus I squared. This now splits into 2 different poles, where the imaginary part still goes quadratically with momentum, but is slightly larger. And we have some additional real part. And now the question is, how does this influence the dynamics, and can we get some qualitative insight from that? And there's also an additional branch point here, which has a neat interpretation as being the threshold for a mode with some wave vector eta to decay in a pair of modes with momentum eta over 2. But I'm not really going to focus on that. You can just graphically take the complex plane in terms of your frequency. You can see that you have 2 poles here and a branch cut starting at minus I over 2k squared. And this is consistent with some previous results where they had found something similar and shown that this just leads to enhanced diffusion rather than superdiffusion. Now I'm going to be a bit more precise. So if we want to quantify resulting dynamics and if it's superdiffusion or not, we could, for example, calculate a time-dependent diffusion constant. So if we just have diffusion, then we know that the squared width of our profile grows linearly in time. So you can just take the time derivative of this. And if this is a constant, it tells us there's going to be diffusion. If it grows in time, you have something that's faster than diffusion, which is one kind of superdiffusion. For example, if it grows linearly in time, you would have ballistic transport. We can directly calculate this time-dependent diffusion constant from the Fourier transform of these correlations. And using this approach, you can actually find a very neat analytic expression for your time-dependent diffusion constant. So we have 1 plus j squared, again, our interaction strength, and then something 1 minus exponential of time, and then something expressed in terms of 2 Bessel functions. And I don't have much intuition with Bessel functions, but they have very neat asymptotics. You can show that at long times, your diffusion constant behaves as 1 plus j squared minus j squared over square root 2 pi of t. So just to show you what this looks like, if I plot the time-dependent diffusion constant, so for within this kind of single split and merge approximation, so only considering x and y loops, if I do this as a function of time at different interaction strengths, so j going from 0.1 to 0.8, I see that I get something, it starts at 1, so the diffusion constant without any Heisenberg term. And essentially, at long times, it saturates to 1 plus j squared with corrections that decay as 1 over square root of time. So at short times, you have something that kind of resembles superdiffusion, where you have a diffusion constant that grows in time. That long times this completely saturates. And now, of course, this is our approximation. Let's see how this compares to what's actually happening.
Question.
Yes.
Sorry, this is really interesting. So, so you have this branching process, and you're just truncating it into, you know, these quadratic
yes.
correlators and so on. But the first question I have is, how important is it that you have X, Y, and Z propagating? Do I need those three, or could I get away with a single density?
No, so you do need all three. So, okay, you could start from a single X and that would split into a Z and Y, but the Heisenberg, so this commutator really only couples a single Z to both X and Y. So each vertex in this diagram needs to have both a Z and X and a Y. So you need to take into account all three of them.
No, I know, but imagine that I simplify the problem and said I have a single species, yes, and it branches and it coalesces, yes, and I reduce the equation as you did. Would I get the same?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have any intuition there.
And the other question I have is, if I only had diffusion, of course I would propagate diffusively.
Yeah.
If I have branching, this initial quote-unquote superdiffusion that you're showing here is not there. Is it because the branching is expanding me more quickly?
Yes, that's how really I interpret this. Yes.
Yeah.
So, I have a slide on this coming up, but then I feel that at long times, any diffusion that you have in your system is going to completely overtake this higher order correction. But I'm going to come back to this when I show you the real case profile of correlations.
Thanks.
Great. So I have this time-dependent diffusion constant. And I can also just do matrix product operator simulations of my full Lindblad equation. So completely forgetting about this graphical picture that we've built up, I can represent my time-evolved operator, so the sigma z evolving in time, as a matrix product operator with some given bond dimension, some fixed error, and evolve using time-evolving block decimation methods. So it's pretty standard and not that interesting to go into. So I'm just going to show you the results. So again, I show you the diffusion constant at these 4 different values of the interaction strength. And so now the colored lines are the exact results. So using these matrix product operator simulations, which we've checked are converged and so can be treated as numerically exact. And the dashed lines are the corresponding kind of first order calculations that we've done using approximation. And we can see that for j equals 0.1, 0.3, 0.5, there's an excellent agreement. It's really good at initial times, and even the long time limit seems to be very well reproduced. So that's kind of some a posteriori justification of our approximation. And for j equals 0.8, you can see, okay, there's some deviation, but it's still manageable. And the interesting thing is also that this first order approximation seems to give an upper bound for the diffusion constant. So if the first, or if this would hold at all times, which of course is zero guarantee that it would, if this first order solution bounds the exact solution, then we are sure that there's no superdiffusion in the exact solution, simply because we know that this first order diffusion constant converges at long times. So that's one way of quantifying the profile. Another way we can do is we have the self-energy, we have the Fourier transform of our profile. We know what it looks like in momentum space. And so if we just assume that these poles that we found aren't just for low energy, low momentum, but more generally, we can evaluate the Fourier transform using a saddle point approximation. And we get some correlations looking like this, where it's just for convenience expressed in continuum space. So we can recognize 2 parts. So the first is exponent minus x squared over 2 dt, where d equals 1 plus j squared, just your long time diffusion constant, so time independent. So we first have some diffusive part. And the second part is we have some unimportant constant times something that has x cubed over t squared. So the neat thing is that the second term does hint at the KPZ scaling, where your characteristic length grows as t to the power of 2/3. But the problem is that at long times, if you have diffusion, the second term is always going to be subleading. So if you're going to calculate the diffusion constant from this profile, at long times, the second term is going to be unimportant. And I'm going to show this in more detail on the next slide, but just first to compare our different approaches. So if I calculate these correlations for, I think, a system with 80 lattice sites, and I plot the correlation profile for some spin initially, some polarization imbalance, initially just purely localized at the origin, I can plot this as 3 different times. So t equals 5, t equals 10, t equals 20. And so the full black line here is the saddle point equation that I've shown you here at the top. The red circles are our numerical MPO simulations, and the blue crosses are the profiles we get by simply integrating these first order equations numerically. And because this is a very small system, so the number of equations grows quadratically within this approximation with latticide, so this is very easy to do. And you can see there's quite good approximation. And if we want to be somewhat fair, we can compare this in a logarithmic scale. And we can see that the MPO results and the results obtained by numerically integrating our first order equations are almost indistinguishable for, I think this is j equals 0.5. So very good agreement between the diffusion constant and also between the profiles. And if we look at the dashed line, you can see that there are some small, sorry, the full black line. There are some small deviations at long distances and short times, but at long times, they, again, almost completely agree with each other. So here we really have different approaches that give the same result. And if I have this real space profile, this is coming back to your question, I can extract the diffusion constant by simply calculating, by interpreting this correlation just as some probability distribution, because it's normalized, calculating the width, taking the time derivative. If I do this and kind of linearize all integrals, I again find a time-dependent diffusion constant, which is just a constant, minus some small correction. And this is really just the contribution from the second term. So at long times, we again obtain a constant diffusion constant, which is only really the first part of this exponent minus x squared over 2 dt. And the second correction is essentially a transient effect, which vanishes as 1 over square root of time. We get the same qualitative 1 over square root of time decay of the, increase of the diffusion constant. So those kind of are results, but of course, we're not the first to think of this problem. So we can compare with results from either some kind of generalized hydrodynamics or just regular hydrodynamics. Because there was this recent paper by Jacopo Dinardis and co-authors, which used some arguments for general hydrodynamics with some more heuristic arguments about scaling of matrix elements to also investigate the same kind of setup. And their results, which was close to the weak noise limit, predicted a weaker form of superdiffusion. We still have a diffusion constant increasing in time, but only logarithmically with time. It's kind of interesting that they couldn't find a transition between this superdiffusion, so this log T, and just regular diffusion, whereas it's pretty clear in our results that we do have enhanced diffusion. So here in their results, they simply plot diffusion constant as a function of log T. Clearly, it's linear. Again, it's different choices of some interaction strength. But so at this weak noise limit, you expect to see a different behavior. And so it's interesting that we can't reproduce this from our first order calculation, which seems to hold very well for dynamics. So there also needs to be some kind of transition, I mean, if their results hold and if ours hold, between this enhanced diffusion, which is only a transient phenomenon, and this log T diffusion, which seems to hold at arbitrary long times. There's actually been some minor disagreement in the literature, not even disagreement, just different results. In this recent Cyclos paper by Gloriosi and co-authors, they also developed some general form of nonabelian hydrodynamics, so not the usual kind of generalized hydrodynamics you expect to see in integrable systems, where they had some kind of current for spin, say take A to be equal to Z. You had some equation with some diffusion constant, so gradient, also a coupling to different components. And that can actually be seen as some kind of mean field treatment of the noisy exchange coupling model that we have introduced in this paper. So we have really a microscopic model for which you could get this diffusion constant, because they start immediately from some kind of field theory. Interesting thing that they found, and they also contrasted their results with those by Jacopo Dinardis and co-authors, that this mean field model also predicts a 1 over square root T correction on the diffusion constant. So the exact same kind of correction that we found here. So it seems that if you have this transition from generalized hydrodynamics to just non-abelian hydrodynamics, if you have enough strong noise on your coupling, you recover the results from this non-abelian hydrodynamics, which is something that we weren't able to do with these arguments from semi-generalized hydrodynamics. There are some heuristic arguments to see what happens into higher order terms. So if you, instead of just considering diffusion of a single Z X, and splitting into X and Y, suppose you go to arbitrary terms, arbitrary orders, and assume them to also diffuse freely. You can, instead of having this branch point at minus I eta squared over 2, which is just a single mode splitting into two different modes, at arbitrary orders, you could also have a branch point just moving to minus I eta squared over n. And there are some arguments to show that if you have simple diffusion at each order, but diffusion of different independent components, you have some kind of exponent of minus alpha, some constant, dk squared times t. Now, precise form, this really isn't important for what I'm trying to tell you. Just that if you have regular diffusion at all orders of these different independent particles, you still expect the dynamical exponent to be z equals 1/2, so just regular diffusion, even if you have these orders. But of course, what we're having here, the higher orders aren't simply an extension of diffusion, because we need to take into account both hardcore constraints and also, as I was already pointing out, these have a very specific structure. So if I just give you a random graph and just connect these in a particular way, you typically won't get a diagram that's consistent with the constraints that you have for this lim-dot equation of motion. Because every single z needs to split into x and y, every x needs to split into a y and a z. So if I would just color every line here, depending on if it's an x, a y, or a z, essentially I end up with a Penrose coloring problem where I would need to have a graph with some fixed boundary constraints and find a way of, if I want to get all possible diagrams at some high order, to find all the possible colorings of some graph. So it's quite a hard problem, probably also a fun one. I'm not sure we're going to get to it, but it's kind of interesting to think about. So that brings me to my outlook and the conclusions. So we've introduced some kind of disordered spin model. We introduced noise to the exchange terms in a Heisenberg Hamiltonian. Near the strong noise limit, we can define some perturbation theory, which has a very neat graphical and diagrammatic interpretation. We could use these diagrams to both calculate the time-dependent diffusion constant analytically within our approximation, and the spin profile with excellent agreement between our approximation and costly matrix product operator simulations. What we found is that near the strong noise limit, superdiffusion gets broken down to enhanced diffusion, which is a transient phenomenon at strongest order. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention. Thanks also for the questions throughout the talk. And also thank the EPSRC for funding. So please let me know if you have any questions or comments.